Okay, well, good evening, everybody. It's lovely to see so many of you here for the Leonardo da Vinci Society annual lecture. I'm the Society's president, Alexander Marr, and this is the first annual lecture that we've been able to hold in person for many years. The Society has been fortunate enough to be able to hold these lectures at the Courtauld Society for some time, and we're very, very grateful to our friends and colleagues here in the Research Forum for allowing us to be here today. I'd like to thank Professor Alex Bovey, the Dean and Director of the Research Forum, and her colleagues Leila Bumbra and Diego Arteche for hosting us and for all their help with promotion. So thank you very much indeed. And you're all welcome to join us after this evening's lecture for a drinks reception hosted by the Society. And may I just take this opportunity to say, if any of you are not members, you have the opportunity to join via our website. An annual membership is yours for the bargain price of £20, which gives you access to exclusive resources on Leonardo da Vinci, including a world-class bibliography, and access to member events at collections and exhibitions throughout the year. We're particularly keen to encourage student members to join. Membership for students is half price. So please do go onto our website. Please follow us on social media. We are on all of it: Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, so you can find us very easily there. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker this evening, Martin Clayton, LVO FSA, who, as many of you will know, is one of the world's leading experts on Leonardo da Vinci and the foremost scholar of his drawings in the Royal Collection. He's a trustee and committee member of the Leonardo da Vinci Society and has worked in the print room at Windsor Castle since 1990, from 2013 as head of prints and drawings for the Royal Collection Trust. He's curated a great many exhibitions on the drawings in the Royal Collection, including shows on Leonardo's anatomical work in 1992, 2010, and 2012 to 13, and on his studies of physiognomy, very memorable exhibition with accompanying catalogue of the Divine and Grotesque of 2002. In the catalogues that accompany his exhibitions and in numerous articles, Martin has really transformed our understanding of Leonardo's graphic oeuvre, and for the 500th anniversary of Leonardo's death in 2019, he curated a staggering 14 exhibitions of Leonardo's drawings at museums and galleries across the UK that were seen by a total of 1,300,000 visitors. And that is impact. His next exhibition, Drawing the Italian Renaissance, will open at the King's Gallery this autumn in the beginning of November, I understand, and he's currently preparing a revised full catalogue of the Leonardos at Windsor. This evening, he will be speaking to us to the title, Describe the Jaw of a Crocodile. That's obviously not it. Leonardo da Vinci's Animal Anatomy. So please join me in welcoming Martin Clayton.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming along this evening. Can everybody hear okay at the back? Yes, good sound. Thank you. Alex has already pointed to the misleading nature of my talk in that we have no drawing of a jaw of a crocodile by Leonardo, so apologies for that. We'll come on to that in a moment. So the perhaps misleading title of the talk comes from a brief note on this miscellaneous sheet at Windsor of about 1509. The layout of the notes curving around that hole at lower left shows that the sheet was already torn when Leonardo compiled it. It's just an informal dumping ground for a range of memoranda, including a list of his dissection tools, such as a forceps, a fine-tooth bone saw, a scalpel and a knife, and on the reverse of the same sheet, in that detail at lower right, he quickly sketched some of his dissecting hooks. Towards the centre of the sheet, arrowed there, is the brief line, describe the tongue of the woodpecker and the jaw of the crocodile. Now this is a type of note found commonly throughout Leonardo's papers, an attempt to pin down and keep track of the many thoughts that were constantly swimming through his mind. His interest in the jaw of the crocodile no doubt comes from the ancient belief recorded by both Herodotus and Pliny that the crocodile has a fixed lower jaw and bites by moving its upper jaw. Now this is of course entirely false. But like many such legends, with the backing of ancient authority, it persisted into the texts of the early modern period. I must note, though, in passing, that I haven't been able to find a single image that shows a crocodile with such a hinged upper jaw, and all these drawings, these prints and manuscript illuminations here, including a woodcut at lower right, show a crocodile with an entirely normal hinged lower jaw. The woodpecker, however, is a true anatomical curiosity. It has an enormously long tongue, which wraps around the back of the brain when retracted. You can see in the illustration at lower left, the red bifurcated tongue that wraps around the brain underneath the cranium. It's a very peculiar thing. Now, the earliest depiction that I can find of this feature is in Francis Willoughby's Ornithology, first published in 1676, of the engraving there at the lower right. But Leonardo clearly knew of the great length of the woodpecker's tongue and the impossibility of fitting the tongue into its mouth alone. So the combination in this one short note of ancient authority and empirical investigation is characteristic of Leonardo's scientific investigations, of which his anatomical studies were the most accomplished. His anatomical work occupied two distinct periods in Leonardo's career. The first in the 1480s, when he was aged around 35, a painter and aspiring sculptor in Sforza, Milan, typified by the skull drawing on the left of the screen. The second period, best illustrated by the drawing on the right, was longer and much more intensive. It ran from about 1506 to 13, when Leonardo was in his late 50s. He spent most of this period again in Milan, now working for the French occupiers of the city, essentially as a multifaceted designer. But much of Leonardo's time was spent not on his designs, but on his scientific studies, such as hydraulics and optics, and most of all anatomy, with the serious aim of publishing illustrated treatises on all of these subjects. He formulated the idea of a treatise on anatomy right at the start of his researches. The idea grew out of his thoughts towards a treatise on painting, which aimed to equip the artist with everything that he needed to know about the appearance of the world of visual and material phenomena. Key among these was, of course, the human body, both its physical structure and its movements, as guided by the senses and emotions. It soon became clear to Leonardo that this was too large a subject to be covered simply by a chapter in a treatise on painting, and so the idea of a separate treatise on anatomy was formed. We have several drafts of contents for such a treatise, and in these we can see a clear evolution in Leonardo's interests. His earliest drafts, such as this from about 1489, the same manuscript as the skull drawing that I just showed, show an overriding interest in the phenomena of life, reproduction, the emotions, the senses, the functioning of the nervous system. It proposes to investigate topics as diverse as laughter, sneezing, conception, epilepsy, paralysis, hunger, sleep, and of course lust. The most detailed of his early studies were his sections of a skull, but his attempt to understand the neural pathways and therefore the functioning of the brain through such sections understandably came to nothing. There's a little evidence that Leonardo may have dissected a human leg at this time, or at least witnessed such a dissection, but very little sense that he was getting to grips with human anatomy at this time. His later outlines for a treatise, however, are much more concerned with structural anatomy. This, from about 1508, is a list of dimostrazioni, by which we assume he means diagrams, of the bones, muscles, tendons, and so on, in various permutations. This shift in focus may be explained, at least in part, by Leonardo's much greater access to human material in these later years. During the period from 1506 to 11, he seems to have had ready access to corpses for dissection. His status and his well-placed friends and associates quite literally opened doors for him. This famous page is one of the great documents in the history of science. It describes in detail Leonardo's dissection of an old man whose death he had witnessed, probably in the winter of 1508. The text will be well known to many of you, but it bears quoting at length. This old man, a few hours before his death, told me that he was over 100 years old and that he felt nothing wrong with his body other than weakness. And thus, while sitting on a bed in the hospital of Santa Marinova in Florence, without any movement or sign of any mishap, he passed from this life. And I dissected him to see the cause of so sweet a death, which I found to be a fainting away through lack of blood to the artery which nourishes the heart and the other parts below, which I found very dry, thin, and withered. I performed this dissection very diligently and with great ease because of the absence of fat and humours, which greatly hinder the recognition of the parts. The other dissection was of a child of 2 years, in which I found everything contrary to that of the old man. This is a remarkable passage. It records the first modern autopsy, the first clear description of coronary vascular occlusion. Leonardo goes on to describe what appears to be cirrhosis of the liver, likewise the first such description in medical history. The artery and vein which run between the spleen and liver generate so thick a coat that it closes the passage of blood from the mesenteric veins, and the liver loses the humours of the blood which was carried there by the vein. Whence the liver is desiccated and becomes like congealed bran, both in colour and substance, so that, with but a little friction, this substance falls away in minute particles like sawdust. Now, this clarity of process and of observation indicate that Leonardo was by now experienced in human dissection. In about 1509, he claimed to have dissected 10 corpses. By the end of his life, this number had grown to 30, and the quantity and quality of the surviving drawings does not contradict this claim. But throughout his anatomical career, Leonardo also dissected animals. In his early years, this was a practical necessity due to his lack of human material, and his subjects included frogs, bears, monkeys, dogs, horses, and even, it seems, a lion. In the later period, even with much more access to human material, his animal dissections continued. We see dissections of dogs, pigs, birds, and cattle, most notably a study of the ox's heart. In part, this was still a practical expedient, as animals would always be more readily obtained than human corpses. Leonardo assumed that the anatomy of all vertebrates with limbs, or as we would now call them tetrapods, was fundamentally similar, differing only in proportions and, in his words, other accidental things. In some respects, this is true. All tetrapods, including mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians, share a common ancestor and have a common body plan. In this slide, you can see the human arm above, a reptile to the left, a whale below, and a bird to the right. And in each of these, you can see a single upper bone, 2 lower bones, a flexible wrist, and digits. And this is something that is shared through all tetrapods from about 350 million years before the Common Era. In the case of birds and whales, the evolutionary divergence has been so radical that this commonality is barely recognizable on the surface. But in the special case of terrestrial mammals, animals were useful surrogates for human corpses. And Leonardo would sometimes adjust the proportions and positions of an animal to resemble a human form. This drawing of the lungs, for example, is probably based on dissection of a pig, to judge from the long spines of the vertebrae. but Leonardo adjusted the proportions and drew the lungs upright so that the viewer assumes he's depicting human anatomy. The surrounding notes make no mention of a species. Leonardo is concerned only with the form and function of the lungs themselves. It's only rarely that he makes an explicit comparison between human and animal anatomy, and the aim there was often to demonstrate the similarities rather than to elucidate the differences. Now, this is the most complex of Leonardo's early sheets of anatomical study. It's drawn in metal point that has faded, so I'll show the drawings in ultraviolet light, which allows us to recover many of the details. The large drawings at centre left depict the thoracic and abdominal organs of a large animal, probably a pig or a dog. But most of the studies are concerned with the bones and nerves of the arm. The hand at lower right is labelled by Leonardo mano di scimmia, hand of a monkey. It shows 5 roughly equal fingers, each with the same number of bones. This is an error. Now, Leonardo's specimen was probably young, as the longer bones have not fully ossified, and the epiphyses, the rounded ends of these longer bones, are shown as distinct small nodules. But in the studies of an upper limb, the short and strongly curved humerus is not that of a primate. It's more suggestive of a dog or other quadruped, and in the upper of those two drawings, Leonardo attempts to adjust the proportions to those of a human. Such a robust and curved humerus is found throughout Leonardo's anatomical drawings, even 25 years later when he had access to human material. As usual, he seems relaxed about the exact form. It was the system that interested him. The upper drawing examines the pathways of the nerves from the spine down the arm. The brachial plexus, where the nerves of the arm leave the spinal column, is shown here to be formed from just 4 spinal nerves, fewer than in a monkey, human or dog, and perhaps a simple error. This would have been a fiddly dissection, which makes even more impressive the small study of the cervical vertebrae as centre left. This illustrates the formation of a spinal nerve from the merger of 2 roots, emerging from the spinal cord and passing through an intervertebral foramen. Leonardo was indeed greatly interested in the spinal cord as crucial to life. It contains neural circuits that can function independently of the brain, and in the note at centre right, he records an episode of vivisection, observing that a decapitated frog can continue to exhibit a semblance of life until the cord itself is destroyed. He writes, "The frog dies instantly when its spinal medulla is perforated, and previously it lived without head, without heart or interior organs, or intestines or skin. Here, therefore, it appears lies the foundation of movement and life." He repeated this observation on the other side of the sheet, again shown here in visible and ultraviolet light. The drawing at upper left is a schematic diagram of the cervical vertebrae and the base of the cranium, with the spinal cord running vertically down through the vertebrae. The note surrounding this diagram states again, the frog retains life for some hours when deprived of head and heart and all viscera, and if you puncture this nerve, it immediately twitches and dies. The spinal cord is accordingly labelled virtu genitiva, roughly generative power. This chimes with Leonardo's early studies of conception, roughly contemporary with this sheet. In this famous study of coition, there are fictive channels running from the spinal cord of both the man and the woman into the penis and uterus respectively, and thus transmitting the animal spirit, the soul if you like, from the brains of both during conception. This page of drawings investigates the complex of structures in the neck, and from the form of the head below it would seem that Leonardo's subject was a monkey. But the hyoid bone, which is drawn very clearly in the study at upper centre, is composed essentially of a chain of separate small bones. This is not the hyoid bone of a primate, and it's difficult to understand what Leonardo has based this on. Now, most of these early drawings investigate vertebrate anatomy in general, with little concern about the morphological details of individual species. The first species that Leonardo seems to have investigated on its own terms was a bear. In the later 1480s, he made these two studies of what must have been a live captive bear, apparently a young individual. The drawing of the whole animal on the right shows it walking correctly on the soles of its feet, what is known as a plantigrade gait. Indeed, the bear is the only large quadruped with a plantigrade gait like man, and so the bear is a valid surrogate for a human subject in the study of the feet. Leonardo then dissected the hind leg of the bear and recorded his findings in a group of drawings in metal point and pen on blue prepared paper. Here he was looking specifically at the details of the bear's foot, rather than thinking about the anatomy of vertebrates more generally. He captured the anatomy with great precision. As you can see in the lower detail, he correctly observed the interpenetration of the two flexor tendons. In each digit, the tendons of fibularis longus passes through a gap in the tendon fibularis brevis, which allows the digit to flex in two different ways. If I can show you, you can either bend your finger holding it straight, or you can curve it like so. This is due to the interpenetration of these two tendons. Now, this ingenious detail passes without comment here, but as we will see, he was to return to this feature some 20 years later. Of course, with any artist, we can only guess at works that have been lost. These studies of the paws of a dog on either side of a sheet in Edinburgh must, from their style, date to the same period as the dissections of the bear's foot. They may suggest that Leonardo made a comparative study of the two animals' feet. Perhaps he also made dissections of a dog's paw on sheets now lost. Two further drawings from a few years later indicate that Leonardo continued to study dogs. This drawing, a careful copy by his pupil Francesco Melzi of a lost drawing by Leonardo, must date to the early 1490s. And this small drawing on a page of one of Leonardo's notebooks in the V&A shows him measuring the proportions of a dog's hair. We'll come to these proportion studies shortly. In themselves, these disparate drawings of dogs tell us little about Leonardo's interests, but they are evidence, I think, of an interest that is more than just casual. But the animal that Leonardo studied most closely throughout his career was the horse, which was central to several of his artistic projects, notably the unfinished mural of the Battle of Anghiari and 3 unexecuted equestrian monuments. Through repeated study, Leonardo developed a deep knowledge of the superficial anatomy of the horse. Here on the left, a study of the 1470s, probably for an adoration of the shepherds, examining in detail the external musculature of a horse's legs. On the right, a drawing of 40 years later, made in France towards Leonardo's final equestrian monument, and studying essentially the same subject matter. His most sustained study of the horse was made around 1490, towards his equestrian monument to Francesco Sforza. To help prepare the colossal clay model for that sculpture, Leonardo took detailed measurements of different breeds of horse. The two studies here are labelled Siciliano di Messe Galeazzo and Geneto Grosso di Messe Galeazzo. That is, a Sicilian and a Genet from the stables of Galeazzo da San Severino, general of the Milanese army. For these studies, Leonardo took as his unit of measurement the length of the horse's head, and you might be able to see in the study on the right the abbreviation T, the testa. While that implies a proportional relationship between the head and other parts of the body, Leonardo had no interest in finding harmonious proportional relations between these different parts. The horse, after all, was not a divinely proportioned body. Leonardo's approach to the horse contrasts markedly with his contemporaneous studies of the human form, in which internal proportional relations were the primary goal. His attempts to find the proportional principles of the human body were not restricted to the overall dimensions, as exemplified by the Vitruvian man. When he began to measure an actual human body, he likewise attempted to find minute proportional principles among the individual parts. In these studies, which I've given you a detail of the left here, of a model named as Caravaggio from the town outside Milan, his method is inconsistent. Some of the dimensions are given in terms of the head, as with the horse. Others are given as a fraction of the whole man, as with the Vitruvian man. And still others are given in relation to another part of the leg. Now, it's not clear what principle or benefit Leonardo thought he might derive by stating, for example, that OP, the thickness of the ankle, is 6/17 of a head. He was clearly struggling to reconcile a theoretical ideal with the results obtained from measuring an individual, and not surprisingly, these proportional studies soon lapsed. But in addition to these detailed studies of the horse's dimensions, Leonardo does seem to have conducted actual dissections of a horse in the years around 1492. Only a couple of drawings survive. That on the left clearly depicts the viscera of some large quadruped, and the slender proportions of the torso and lower limbs would suggest a horse. The drawing alongside seems to have been made as a pair, seen from the same aspect. It shows the lower vertebrae and the nerves emerging from the lumbar plexus, with the organs of the previous drawing removed. The study is annotated albero delle corde or vero nervi, tree of the nerves, without specifying a species. The vertebrae have been drawn very broad, as if it were a much smaller animal, but this may simply have been a diagrammatic device to clarify the arrangement of the nerves emerging from the vertebral foramina. What was the purpose of these horse dissections, if that's what they were? Giorgio Vasari stated in his biography of Leonardo, written in the mid-16th century, that Leonardo had compiled a book of anatomy of horses made by him for his own studies, but that had been lost. We've no clue what Vasari based this information on, but these two drawings alone do support the idea that Leonardo made an extensive study of the deep anatomy of the horse in the years after 1490. Now, rather abruptly, Leonardo's anatomical studies, both human and animal, then lapsed until the next century. His proportion studies were leading him nowhere, and he had too little human material to make any progress in his study of human anatomy, especially in the field of neuropsychology, which was the focus of his interests around 1490. His anatomical studies were revived, however, after 1503, when he was commissioned to paint the huge mural of the Battle of Anghiari in the Palazzo della Signoria in Florence. The figures in that mural were to be over life size, and as with the Sforza monument, therefore, Leonardo prepared for the project not only with compositional studies, but also with a survey of the external musculature of man. Inexorably, this led him back into structural anatomy, to speculate on the form of the muscles beneath the skin, and then the deeper anatomical structures. The horse was just as much a subject to the Battle of Anghiari as was man. Leonardo did not study the horse in the same orthogonal views as he did man, and almost all of the horse studies for Anghiari show the animal in dynamic poses. But his investigations of deeper human anatomy did lead to one of the few periods of true comparative anatomy in Leonardo's researches. This page is inscribed "Second Demonstration, interposed between anatomy and life," an accurate description of a drawing that shows the legs posed as in life, but with the muscles in a manner visible only once the skin and fascia has been stripped away. He goes on to remind himself, "You will draw for this comparison, a questo paragone, the legs of frogs, which have a great similarity to the legs of man, as much in the bones as in their muscles. Then you will follow with the hind legs of a hare, which are very muscular and have distinct muscles because they are not encumbered with fat." Now, we don't have any drawings by Leonardo of the legs of a frog or a hare, but what we do have are his studies of the horse's leg, in strict comparison with that of man. This is seen in a formal manner on this sheet on the right at about 1506, 1508, and maybe more engagingly on these two small folios from one of his small pocketbooks of the period. At upper left, you can see how his sketched a human form crouched on tiptoes. That's the smaller drawing at lower left there, below a study of the horse's bones and muscles. The more formal sheet on the right shows the bones of horse and man alongside each other, with threads between the iliac crest and the femur to represent the central line of actions of the muscles. The notes around those drawings read, junction of the fleshy muscles with the bones, without any tendon or cartilage, and you should do the same for several animals. Show a man on tiptoes so that you may compare a man better with other animals. Represent the knee of a man bent like that of a horse. Of the relationship that exists between the arrangements of the bones and muscles of animals and that of the bones and muscles of man. Now this sort of note is characteristic of Leonardo's researches around 1508. He was still casting around to determine the scope and structure of his revived anatomical investigations, and he clearly began to think of comparative anatomy as a fertile subject. He revisited his early assumption that the anatomy of all vertebrates is essentially the same. He started to think more clearly about families of animals with common anatomy, and with substantive, not just proportional differences between those groupings. This is another page from the so-called anatomical manuscript B, the same manuscript in which he made his earlier skull drawings, which he began to compile again after a lapse of about 18 years. The study of the human bladder is based on the dissection of the old man that I described earlier, and this first-hand experience led Leonardo to set out a general plan for comparative anatomy. Describe the various forms of the viscera of the human species, of apes and such like. Then in what way the leonine species differ, and then the bovine, and finally birds, and arrange this description in the manner of a discourse. He expands on these groupings in another page of the same manuscript, and here he divides mammals into what taxonomically we would now call orders, the basic subdivisions of the class of mammals. The first are primates, and it's striking that Leonardo does not consider man a species apart or a separate case. Indeed, he makes the explicit point that apes and monkeys are almost the same species as man. The second group are felines, fairly straightforward, and the third are equines of the order Perissodactyla, that is, hooved mammals, ungulates, with an odd number of toes. Leonardo's fourth group includes cattle, deer, goats, and even giraffes. We'd now recognise this as the order Artiodactyla, ungulates with an even number of toes. Perhaps surprisingly, Leonardo based this grouping not on the anatomy of their feet, as we do today, but on their teeth. He noted correctly that artiodactyls lack incisors in the upper jaw, but his definition of the perissodactyla through their dentition is not reliable. Leonardo stated that horses have incisor teeth above and below, but in some species of perissodactyla, only the male, the dentition is dependent on the sex of the animals. In horses, for example, only the males possess canines. Nonetheless, this is a remarkably clear division of the mammals, and one that is still valid to this day. Perhaps one of the most engaging of Leonardo's comparative anatomies at this time is his study of the eye, which he first wrote about on several occasions around 1493 and again around 1510. Now you'll have to excuse me as I quote his notes extensively, as there are few drawings to accompany these passages, other than these marginal diagrams. Here on the left, for example, he makes a note to study the anatomy of various eyes and see which are the muscles which open and close the pupils of animals. The eyes of all animals have their pupils adapted to dilate and diminish in proportion to the greater and lesser light, but in birds the variation is much greater, and particularly in nocturnal birds such as owls. In these the pupil dilates in such a way as to occupy nearly the whole eye, or diminish to the size of a grain of millet, and always preserves the circular form. But in the lion tribe, the pupil diminishes from a perfect circle to the figure of a pointed oval, as shown in the margin. You can see that at the right of the screen there. Man, having a weaker sight than any other animal, is less hurt by a very strong light, and his pupil increases but little in dark places. But in the eyes of nocturnal animals, such as the owl, the power of vision increases so much that in the faintest nocturnal light, which we call darkness, it sees with much more distinctness than we do in the day. It makes a point, however, that nocturnal animals are not seeing in total darkness. If you make a cat leap by daylight among a quantity of jars and crocks, you will see them remain unbroken. But if you do the same at night, many will be broken. Night birds do not fly about unless the moon shines full or in part. Rather, they feed between sundown and the total darkness of night. And from this, Leonardo draws a more general point about optics, that images of objects do not exist in space independently of the light that falls upon them. He writes, "The form of objects do not send their images into the air if they are not illuminated. The eye cannot receive that from the air which the air does not possess." He goes on to observe that of the many animals that prey at night when the little light is wanting, they direct themselves by their strong sense of hearing and of smell, in which they are far superior to man. And finally, he speculates on the correlation between the acuity of the senses and the form of the sensory organs, with reference to what must have been dissection of a captive lion. "I've seen in the lion that the sense of smell is connected with the part of the brain which comes down the nostrils, which form a spacious receptacle for the sense of smell. The eyes in the lion have a large part of the head for their sockets, and the optic nerves communicate directly with their brain. The contrary is to be seen in man, for the sockets of the eyes are but a small part of the head, and the optic nerves are fine, long, and weak, and thus we see by day but badly at night." We'll now pass to the period around 1510, when Leonardo had his greatest access to human material for dissection. During the winter of 1510-1511, he seems to have been working at the medical school at the University of Pavia, alongside the professor of anatomy there, Marcantonio della Torre. Leonardo may have dissected up to 20 corpses that winter, and from these dissections he compiled a series of 18 surviving sheets, now known collectively as the Anatomical Manuscript A, and you see two of the greatest sheets from that series on screen. Among the 240 individual drawings in that manuscript, based primarily on human dissection, he did still occasionally cite his earlier animal dissections. This large study of the tendons of the foot, for example, conspicuously lacks the band-like ligament, extensor retinaculum, that holds in place the extensor tendons on the front of the ankle. He had depicted this structure in the early study of the bear's foot, as I remind you here, and he clearly thought that this ligament was peculiar to the bear, for in a note he reminded himself to make a discourse on the hands of each animal in order to show in what way they vary, as with the bear, in which the ligament joins together the tendons of the toes over the ankle, exactly as is drawn here. More generally, on this same drawing, he made a note to depict here the foot of the bear and of the monkey and of other animals as far as they differ from the foot of man, and put also the feet of some bird. Now you may remember in Leonardo's early studies of the bear's foot the detail of the interpenetrating flexor tendons. When he came to dissect the human hand in 1510, he found exactly the same structure, and in one of his most elegant and compelling sheets from this period, he picked out this detail for particular attention. He must surely have recalled finding it in the dissections of the bear. He was entranced by the elegance of this arrangement, and surrounded that detail with the note, "Provided that the book on the elements of mechanics comes before the demonstration of the movements of man and other animals, and by these means you will be able to prove all your propositions." Now Leonardo's beliefs about the origins of such an elegant, even perfect arrangement might be characterized by what today would be called intelligent design. God is not cited explicitly. In the Anatomical Manuscript A, he does laud the first composer of such a machine, il primo componitore, and attributes a subtle feature to the master, il maestro. But more frequently, in fact 7 times in the Manuscript A, the author of a particular feature is given as natura, nature. For example, here you see the wisdom of nature in providing two causes of movement in each limb. To the same period belong Leonardo's most elegant dissections of a bird's wing. In part, these were performed to inform his designs of a flying machine, which was to be powered by a man operating huge wings of canvas stretched over a system of levers. Though he did realize that the angle of the wings affected a bird's flight, Leonardo had no understanding of aerodynamic lift. Instead, he believed that flight was achieved primarily through the flapping of the wings, and he must have been encouraged in his dreams of human flight by finding essentially the same structures in the bird's wing and the human arm. In these two sheets, both of around 1510, one human, one avian, you can see biceps attached to the humerus and the extensor carpi muscles running down the radius and ulna to attach to the bones of the wrist, best seen in the drawing at lower left and upper right. We now enter the final phase of Leonardo's anatomical work. In 1511, his employers, the French occupiers of Milan, started to lose their grip on the city, and Leonardo spent much of the next 2 years at the family villa of his pupil Francesco Melzi at Vaprio to the east of Milan. He lost his access to human material, and his dissections at this time were mostly of dogs and oxen. Three concerns dominate his surviving drawings from this period: the structure of the thorax, the functioning of the heart, and embryology. His study of embryology is perhaps the most striking and misleading of his applications of animal dissection to the human form. Around 1508, in these drawings here, he had dissected a pregnant cow, and in his anatomical notebook he made these detailed drawings. On the left are two studies of the biconnuate or two-chambered bovine uterus with its membranes and multiple cotyledonous placenta. On the right, he explores in great detail the blood supply to the fetus through the umbilicus. These drawings are explicitly bovine in form. The fetal calf is visible in the drawing at lower left, and the page is headed Matrice di Vacca, uterus of the cow. But in the notes, Leonardo refers simply to mother and infant. Again, he seems to assume that all mammals have essentially the same reproductive structures, and only the proportions and orientation differ. So in his studies of the human reproductive system around 1511, Leonardo applied to the human form the structures that he'd observed in his dissections of the cow. Although there is some evidence that Leonardo dissected a preterm infant, he never observed the single discoidal placenta of the human. And we see, therefore, in his human anatomies, the multiple placenta that he'd observed in the cow, with interdigitating filaments or cotyledons from the two portions of the placenta. Among the many notes on this famous sheet on the right, he reminded himself again to procure the membrane of a calf when it is born and observe the cotyledons, if they are male or female. He was fascinated by how a fetus could fit into the uterus of the woman. He states, the length of a child when born is usually one braccio, about 60 centimeters long, but experience in the dead shows the uterus to be a quarter of a braccio in its greatest length in a woman. He repeatedly draws the fetus curled up to occupy the smallest space possible, and in a long note on the sheet on the right, he compares the size of the human uterus to that of the cow and the horse in proportion to their bodies. This sheet on the left bears the date 9th January 1513, and the note, look at the dead dog, its loins and diaphragm, and the movement of its ribs. The four neat oval diagrams are therefore studies of the thoracic cavity of the dog, with the lungs, diaphragm and ribs seen in the most complete drawing at upper left. The similar studies on the right, however, are of an ox, as indicated by the single word boa above the study at lower right. Leonardo was primarily interested in the roles of the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles between the ribs, and the mechanisms of breathing. This was a topic that he'd studied in the human a couple of years earlier, and in all of these drawings, the species is irrelevant. The same is true of his studies of the heart. This was perhaps the most impressive of all of Leonardo's scientific studies. In his extensive notes, Leonardo makes no reference to the species dissected. Features such as the form of the aortic heart are bovine, and all of these studies seem to have been carried out on the hearts of oxen. But the basic structure of the bovine heart is essentially the same as that of the human, and Leonardo was therefore able to make observations on the form and functions of the valves that bear comparison with modern understanding. Leonardo's practical anatomical work ceased after his departure from Lombardy in September 1513. He moved to Rome under the patronage of Giuliano de' Medici, but this patronage seems to have been no protection against slander. Leonardo claims in the draft of a letter to have been hindered in anatomy, blamed before the Pope and likewise at the hospital by a troublesome German mirror maker, Giovanni degli Specchi. The hospital was presumably that of Santo Spirito, close to the Vatican, but we have no record of any dissections that Leonardo may have carried out or tried to carry out at this time. All we have are fragments of what seemed to have been a study on the movement of quadrupeds. This had been indicated in his notes as early as 1490, when he wrote, "The walking of man is always after the universal manner of walking of animals with four legs, inasmuch as, just as they move their feet crosswise, after the manner of a horse in trotting, so man moves his four limbs crosswise. That is, if he puts forward his right foot in walking, he puts forward with it his left arm, and vice versa." A full 25 years later, we find him reminding himself to note on the bendings of joints, and in what way the flesh grows in their flexions or extensions, and of this write a separate treatise on the movements of animals with 4 feet, among which is man, who likewise in his infancy crawls on all fours. Now we see this interest in this, one of his most charming late drawings, a study of cats, lions, and of course a dragon, in a wide range of poses, sleeping, fighting, stalking, and so on. At the bottom of the sheet, Leonardo has noted, "On flexion and extension, this animal species, of which the lion is prince, because the joints of its vertebrae are so flexible," and there the note stops. Now there's no evidence that anything substantial came from this study. Leonardo's interest in anatomy, like most of his scientific pursuits, rapidly subsided in the last years of his life, especially after he moved to France in 1516. And there his last great campaign of animal study was again a study of the musculature of the horse. This was made in connection with his final project for an equestrian monument, probably for the French king. Leonardo had acquired a detailed knowledge of the horse's anatomy over the last 40 years, but he was not content simply to rely on this knowledge. He began once more to make a sequence of drawings of the horse's muscles, both in orthogonal views and posed in the manner of the intended sculpture. Nothing came of this monument, but these final drawings are testament to a lifetime study and to Leonardo's deep understanding of the anatomy of animals. In October 1517, Cardinal Luigi of Aragon visited the studio of the 65-year-old Leonardo at Amboise. His secretary noted the paintings that they were shown and went on to state, this is Amboise by the way, "This gentleman has written in great detail on anatomy, with illustrations of the members, muscles, nerves, veins, joints, intestines, whatever else can be discussed in the bodies of men and women, in a manner that has never yet been done by anyone else. All this we have seen with our own eyes." And he said that he had dissected more than 30 bodies, both male and female, of all ages, no mention of animals. He's also written on the nature of water, on diverse machines, and on other things, which he set down in countless volumes, all in the vulgar tongue, which, if they're published, will be profitable and very delightful. But Leonardo made no attempt to put his researches into any kind of publishable order. On his death in 1519, his pupil and heir, Francesco Melzi, inherited a mass of unsorted papers. And perhaps understandably, he failed to do anything substantial with Leonardo's anatomical material. It's notable that most early writers on Leonardo pick out the anatomical drawings for special mention. So they were known about, and their unique nature was acknowledged, but their content was not understood in any detail. I mentioned earlier Giorgio Vasari's statement that Leonardo had compiled a book on the anatomy of horses, made by him for his studies, but that was lost. This has occasionally been identified with the so-called Codex Huygens in the Morgan Library, a manuscript now attributed to Carlo Urbino. The Codex Huygens was probably compiled in the 1560s, in part through copying Leonardo's originals. Here we have one of the proportion drawings, and the copy in the Codex Huygens on the right screen. Some of these, however, are now lost, known only through the Huygens. This is a drawing that we have. On the right, what must have been en suite with Leonardo's drawing, but a drawing that we no longer have. But none of the folios of the Codex Huygens can really be described as anatomies, and we have no idea what Vasari might have been referring to. Although the manuscript in New York deals with the proportions of both humans and horses, there's no attempt to draw parallels between them. This is an exercise in compilation rather than comparison. The Codex Huygens is indeed an isolated phenomenon. While there were treatises on animal husbandry published in the 16th century, there was little or nothing on the anatomy of animals. It was not until 1598 that Carlo Ruini published the Anatomia del Cavallo, the first detailed anatomical study of the horse. This was illustrated with woodcuts in the manner of Vesalius's De Humani Corporis Fabrica on humans of 1543. And while some scholars have suggested that these plates were influenced, dreadful word, by Leonardo's studies of a century earlier, there's really nothing to support this. So it was not until the decades around 1900 that Leonardo's drawings, manuscripts and notes were first published and finally appreciated. As with so much of his scientific work, his animal anatomies have no perceptible impact on the general development of the subject. But I hope that this evening I've given some sense of his incredibly impressive work in this field, dedicated and full of insights, and how it fits with so many other aspects of his work. Thank you very much.